The last lecture talked about how there is a relationship between photosynthesis, which takes the sun's energy and turns it into glucose, and then what living organisms do with that glucose, which is cellular respiration. All organisms, whether it is a plant or an animal, whether the organism can make their own food or not, must take glucose and turn it into ATP, usable cellular energy. So while photosynthesis only occurs in plants, both plants and animals, all organisms, must undergo the process of turning glucose into ATP. So this slide, which we already had yesterday, said that cellular respiration occurs in 3 steps. It starts with glycolysis, then moves to the Krebs cycle, and then the electron transport chain. Well, this is definitely the process if and only if, and let me go back to this slide, if and only if oxygen is available, okay? If oxygen is not available, it does not go through these 3 stages. It only goes through these 3 stages if oxygen is available. So whether or not oxygen is available, the first step of taking glucose and turning it into ATP is glycolysis. Glycolysis itself does not need to have oxygen, and glycolysis itself occurs in the cytoplasm. Glycolysis makes 2 net ATPs and 2 molecules of what is called pyruvic acid. Now the pyruvic acid, what happens to it depends on whether or not there is oxygen present. If there is oxygen present, then the pyruvic acid molecules will enter the mitochondria to undergo the next steps of making ATP. Okay, that is when that's when those molecules will undergo what's called the Krebs cycle and enter the electron transport chain. If there is no oxygen present, the pyruvic acid that was made during glycolysis will not enter the mitochondria, and it will stay in the cytoplasm. Okay, so let me go to where, now here we go. So the fate of the pyruvic acid, what happens to it? So as I just said, there's 2 possibilities that it will take depending on whether or not oxygen is present. Okay, so I've already actually said a lot of this. If the oxygen is present, the pyruvic acid will enter the mitochondria and will undergo aerobic respiration, which means that there's oxygen present. Aerobic respiration means a respiration that is in the presence of oxygen. Aerobic respiration includes the stages known as the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain. Okay. Aerobic respiration will yield a lot more ATP than glycolysis. As you'll recall, glycolysis will only yield 2 ATPs. What are the 2 major stages of aerobic respiration? We've talked about these. I've mentioned them, like as in their names, the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain. What are the main points of the Krebs cycle? The Krebs cycle will oxidize glucose. The oxidation of glucose is completed, which what that means, if something is undergoing oxidation, it means that there is a loss of electrons. Okay, further, the hydrogen that is removed from the pyruvic acid will be accepted by the electron carrier NAD+, and will form NADH. There will be, from the Krebs cycle, a small yield of ATP. Then the electron transport chain. The NADH that is produced during glycolysis, which we're not really worrying about that detail, and the Krebs cycle will be used to produce ATP. Most of the ATP produced during aerobic respiration is produced from the electron transport chain. That is something I'm going to want you to know. Like between glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain, which one produces the most ATP? And as it clearly says here, it's the electron transport chain. Okay, so how does the respiration... Okay, we can skip that slide. Okay, I'm going to go over the slide just as in, oh, look at what it's pointing at, but I'm not going to ask you these things. Okay, just make sure you have it in your notes. So obviously this is a mitochondria. A mitochondria is a double membraned organelle. So there is both an outer membrane and an inner membrane. Then you have all of these folds. The folds itself is called the cristae, okay? By having all of these folds, that increases the surface area at which these chemical reactions can occur. And then within the cristae is the matrix. And the matrix is like similar in idea to what the cytoplasm is, okay, or what the stroma is, right? It's that material that fills the volume of either the cell or an organelle. Okay, the matrix is the space inside the inner membrane, right? It contains enzymes that are needed for the chemical reactions of the Krebs cycle and also has some DNA and some ribosomes. The inner membrane has folds and loops called the cristae. The cristae, like I just said, increases the surface area for the reactions of this cellular respiration process. The Krebs cycle occurs in the matrix of the mitochondria, and the electron transport chain occurs along the cristae of the membranes. I will not be asking that detail. What I would like you to know, what you do need to know, is that the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain occur within the mitochondria, but it will not get to that level of detail. At the end of glycolysis, about 90% of the chemical energy that was available in glucose in the molecule is still unused. Okay, but don't forget, glycolysis only yields a little bit of ATP, only 2 net ATP. That is only about 10% of what is available. The other 90% is released during this chemical reaction in the presence of oxygen. So first we're going to talk about the bridge reaction. And you were already like, what? I haven't heard of this. And yeah, you are right. Because what we're talking about are the big chemical reactions, which would be glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain. Glycolysis, as I've already said, is what starts the chemical reaction breaking down the glucose and ends up making 2 pyruvic acid molecules. So before the pyruvic acid is able to undergo the rest of the chemical reactions, it must go through this bridge reaction. So we're going to go through these steps. So first we've got the pyruvic acid. Okay, it enters the mitochondria. And the first thing that happens is that 3 chain is converted into a 2 chain. And notice right here that it says that it yields off a molecule of carbon dioxide. So that is considered, when the glucose is broken down, right, it takes glucose and it takes oxygen and it makes carbon dioxide, water, and ATP. So here is some of that carbon dioxide that gets made by breaking off one of these carbons from the pyruvic acid. The 3-carbon pyruvic acid is converted to a 2-carbon acetate. This is accomplished by removing 1 molecule of CO2 from the molecule of pyruvic acid. The carbon dioxide is then released into the air. For each pyruvic acid that is converted to an acetate, 1 molecule of NAD+ is converted into 1 molecule of NADH. So here we have the pyruvic acid, 3 carbons. We've got the 2 carbons left over. 1 carbon is combined with oxygen to make carbon dioxide, and 2 of the NAD pluses, which is a carrier, right? A carrier molecule turns into NADH. That is going to end up being used into the electron transport chain. Coenzyme A attaches to the acetate to form what is called an acetyl-CoA. The acetyl-CoA will be used by the Krebs cycle. So notice what is happening is the pyruvic acid, which is made by glycolysis, undergoes the bridge reaction and turns into what is called acetyl-CoA. Acetyl-CoA is what gets used by the Krebs cycle. This reaction is often referred to as the bridge reaction because it bridges the gap between the cytoplasm and the mitochondria. It bridges the gap between the anaerobic condition of the cytoplasm. Remember, glycolysis happens in the cytoplasm and there's no oxygen present. It bridges the gap between oxygen not being present and oxygen being present in the mitochondria. Finally, it bridges that gap between the reaction that is the glycolysis and the chemical reaction that is the Krebs cycle. So what I really would like you to know here, the only thing I want you to know really, well, not the only thing, there's a couple really important things that the bridge reaction does here, and that is that it takes pyruvic acid, it changes the molecule into what is called acetyl-CoA, which is now able to enter the Krebs cycle. And then the other big thing that the bridge reaction does is that it produces carbon dioxide gas. Okay, the Krebs cycle. Whoa, I'm going too fast. The Krebs cycle, hey, what do you know, was named after this dude named Hans Krebs. And he worked this out in the 1930s. The Krebs cycle is also a chemical reaction that uses the acetyl-CoA to make hydrogen atoms, ATP, and carbon dioxide. This set of reactions occurs in the matrix of the mitochondria. All you need to worry about is the Krebs cycle occurs in the mitochondria. Okay, so here are the steps. Acetyl-CoA attaches to the 2-carbon acetate. Acetyl-CoA attaches the 2-carbon acetate to the 4-carbon, all right, here we go, oxaloacetic acid to produce 6-carbon compound called citric acid. The acetyl-CoA is regenerated to be used again and again. So the acetyl-CoA is something that gets recycled. The 6-carbon citric acid releases a molecule of carbon dioxide to form a 5-carbon compound. As citric acid is oxidized, the hydrogen is transferred from NAD+ to NADH. The 5-carbon compound releases carbon dioxide and a hydrogen atom, forming a 4-carbon compound. NAD+ is reduced to NADH, and one more molecule is produced. One more molecule of ATP is produced, This 4-carbon compound releases hydrogen to form another 4-carbon compound. This time, the hydrogen is used to reduce FAD to FADH2. Ooh, is your mind being blown yet? Your mind would be blown if this was a college biology class because you would be learning all of these details, as I once did a long time ago. In the last step, the 4-carbon oxaloacetic acid is regenerated, which keeps the Krebs cycle going. The hydrogen that is released to use, The hydrogen that is released is used to form a final NADH. All right, so summary of the Krebs cycle, and then I'm going to kind of let you know what I would like you to know. All right, NAD plus and FAD are electron carriers, very similar to the NADP plus that's used in photosynthesis. NAD plus and FAD will deliver high energy electrons of the hydrogen to the electron transport chain. Okay, so the summary of the Krebs cycle. So this says what's the total amount of carbon dioxide, ATP, NADH, and FADH2 that is produced during one turn of the Krebs cycle. So this is key, one turn, okay? Because, well, I'll explain why that's important in a second. Okay, so the answer to that is 2 carbon dioxides and 1 ATP. Also 3 NADH, which I would not ask you, and 1 FADH2, which I again would not ask you. The above totals are for 1 molecule of pyruvic acid. However, how many molecules are produced by glycolysis of pyruvic acid? I'm not going to go back to the slides, but glucose has 6 carbons. Glucose is C6H12O6. Pyruvic acid only has 3 carbons. So since glucose has a total of 6 and pyruvic acid has a total of 3, there are 2 of these pyruvic acids made by glycolysis. One turn of the Krebs cycle uses 1 of the pyruvic acids. So one turn of the Krebs cycle produces this, while 2 turns of the Krebs cycle will produce 4 carbon dioxides, 2 ATPs, 6 NADH, and 2 FDH2. Okay, so let's see. Okay, so right here, so it says, now remember that during glycolysis, glucose is broken down into 2 molecules of pyruvic acid. I said that. Therefore, 1 glucose, which don't forget has 6 carbons, will cause 2 turns of the Krebs cycle. Therefore, that's how you end up with 4 carbon dioxides, because 1 turn makes 2, and then that's for 1 pyruvic acid, and then the second pyruvic acid will enter and make 2 more, and then a total of 2 ATP, etc. Okay, what happens to each of these products? The carbon dioxide is released when you exhale. The ATP is used for cellular activities. The NADH and the FADH2 will be used in the next stage, which is the electron transport chain, and that is where huge amounts of the ATP is produced. Because let's realize for a second how much ATP total has been made by glycolysis and the Krebs cycles for 1 molecule of glucose. So there are 2 net ATPs for glycolysis, and there are 2 ATPs made total for 1 glucose by the Krebs cycle. So between glycolysis and the Krebs cycle, for 1 molecule of oxygen, only 3 ATP have been made. It is in the electron transport chain where a lot more ATP is actually made.